having been knocking around the church for a few years, I often find myself slipping into the Uncle Albert role in Only Fools and Horses. During the war, and then I tell a story from decades gone by. In the late 1980s, during the war, I would often come along to an originally named group here called Thursday Club, because it was held on a Thursday and it was a club for children. And I think, if I were a betting man, I think that this story of Jacob and Esau is one of the earliest stories that I can remember us looking at. Now, as part of Thursday Club, the theme of the structure was fairly normal and fairly standard. We would watch a video called Superbook. Now, Superbook was an American cartoon, and the basic concept was that there would be two children, 8, 10 years old, who would get a Bible. They wouldn't do a sword drill. They would get a Bible, open up the Bible, and sort of say, oh, what's going on in that passage? And then somehow they would get magically transported into that story in the Bible. And they would actually be there and watch and engage with the narrative of that particular passage. And there is a Superbook episode, which is where these two children go into the Bible, go into the story of Jacob and Esau, get transported into that time and would engage with the characters. Ken, you must remember Superbook. Ken doesn't remember Superbook. There is a deficiency in your Baptist ecclesiology. And following the video, of course, we would fill in a worksheet, and then following the rich Baptist tradition of a rich tea biscuit and a glass of watered down orange squash from a plastic cup to ensure that our stomachs were full. Watch Superbook, Ken. As we move on to explore this narrative, and as we start this particular season, we are joining a family some 2,000 years before Christ. Tent dwellers in southern Israel. A family which is little more than a box of kindling wood, one mere spark from eruption. The brothers bicker. The parents play favourites. There is deception everywhere we look. If we roll back just a couple of chapters to the beginning of Jacob and Esau, we discover that these children were completely different from the moment of their birth. Esau came out first. He was the elder twin. But Jacob came out grabbing onto Esau's heel. And that set a pattern that didn't really change over the years. Esau, the leader, but Jacob, the heel grabber, grasping for what he could get. Now, it can be a bit tricky when going back some 4,000 or so years to see the synergy with the here and now. We might go camping occasionally, but we wouldn't necessarily call ourselves tent dwellers. We probably don't need to worry too much about going out to hunt for food, although we may have an allotment or a vegetable patch in our garden. I'm not sure that we necessarily need to worry too much about bestowing a blessing on our eldest child, and may get a solicitor to sort those things out. Often the trick with these passages is to pull out both the microscope and the telescope. The microscope to look into the passage and to see what's happening, what's the inner workings of what is going on. And then the telescope to try and future spot, to look ahead in the horizon and see what the narrative means to us in the here and now. The passage that Liz read is this tale of deception. Isaac calls in his elder son Esau into the tent, secretively away from everybody else. Say, I'm going to bestow that blessing on you now. Just go out into the countryside, get some animal, make that tasty food that I like, and then I will bestow the blessing. Isaac's wife, Rebekah, overhears this conversation. And she goes to Jacob and said, go and kill a couple of those goats that we've got in the backyard. I'll make the food. We'll dress you up as Esau. We'll send you in to take in the food, and we'll get you in, and then Isaac will bless you instead of your brother Esau. This is a little bit of a warped family, I think. Jacob dresses up as Esau. He takes in the food. He is blessed by Isaac after tricking Isaac into believing that he's Esau that he's talking to and not Jacob. Are you following me? And then Jacob departs. Moments later, Esau comes back with the food, with the tasty meal. And Isaac says, well, who's this? Who are you? I'm Esau, your eldest. And the deception, the trickery is brought to the surface at that point. Who is at fault here? Who is at fault here and why? Like that game of Cluedo, Mrs. Scarlett in the library with the candlestick. Who was at fault? Who is at fault here and why? Well, we've got the four characters. We've got Isaac. Isaac, the son of Abraham. Isaac secretively calls in his son, Esau, to bestow that blessing on him. Perhaps this is what we might know today as the last will and testament. But to be binding, this blessing needed to be in the presence of witnesses. Esau was the elder son, and in normal circumstances, the blessing, usually land and cattle and that sort of thing, would go to him. But again, if we just go back to chapter 25, and if you're in the small groups this week, I would encourage you just to spend a little time looking at chapter 25 to get a glimpse of some of the context. We read that the Lord said that the older son, Esau, would serve the younger son, Jacob. Isaac, by calling in Esau secretively, is seeking to circumvent what God said in order to pass the blessing on to his elder son. So is Isaac the one at fault here? Is he the one that did it? What about Rebekah? Rebekah, the wife of Isaac. They'd started off, Isaac and Rebekah, in love for each other, but things had moved on. Rebekah listened in on this ostensibly private conversation, but then immediately sprung into action to seek to deceive her husband by getting her other son, again in chapter 25, her favoured son, to say, go out, get the food, dress up, and ensure that you get the blessing. Rebekah, possibly the author of this deception. Is Rebekah the one at fault? Then we have Esau, the older son, ostensibly, he was one who was caught in all of this. He can't possibly be at fault. It was nothing to do with him. He was simply following instructions, the Nuremberg defense. However, again, chapter 25, go back to one of the earlier interactions between Jacob and Esau. And we see Esau coming back from the countryside, having been out hunting for ages, and he's exhausted. He's really, 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 really tired. And he says, look, I'm on the verge of death. Give me something to eat. You're Jacob, you're over there, you're cooking. Can I have some of that food? I'm famished. I'm about to die. And Jacob, nice brother that he was, said, yeah, of course you can have some food. Just swear to me your birthright before I give it to you. In other words, swear to me that I can have the blessing that you're due to get instead of the way around that it should be. We do gardening, don't we? We go out and we make ourselves a bit tired. We don't necessarily come back and say, oh, I'm going to die unless I have something to eat. Esau wasn't really that hungry. He probably could have coped. But what he did at this point was he made a verbal oath. He said, yeah, okay, I'm just going to let you have my birthright. I don't want it, you have it. I just want something to eat. And that looks really nice down there. So we have a verbal transaction. We have a verbal oath, which was enough to make that transaction legal. Yet here, sometime later, we have Esau agreeing to go against that oath and claim the blessing for himself. Are you following this? It's like EastEnders, isn't it? And then we have Jacob, possibly the main protagonist here, which is probably just as well as we're embarking on a series on Jacob, who dressed up as Esau. He went to the wardrobe and got the clothes out with his mother. He took in the food that had been made by Rebekah. He lied to his father about who he was, and then he claimed the blessing for himself. Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, Jacob. Who's at fault? We have deception. We have trickery. We have lies. We have acting contrary to a legal agreement. We have favoritism. We have acting contrary to what God has said. Who is at fault here? One of my favorite lines from Shakespeare comes from the film, comes from the play King Lear. King Lear starts with this narrative where King Lear is getting old and he wants to divide his kingdom amongst his three daughters, who are? Go on, Keith. Regan, Goneril, and Cordelia. Very good. Very good. If anyone goes on University Challenge and needs a fellow competitor, go for Keith. We have Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia, the three daughters of King Lear. And King Lear says, I'm going to share my kingdom amongst you, but you've just got to, tell me how good I am. Go on, tell me how good I am. And the older two daughters go along with that. They say how wonderful he is. The younger daughter says, I ain't going to flatter you. I'm your daughter, and I'll honour you as a daughter, but I ain't going to flatter you. And King Lear gets a bit annoyed with this. And so he sends Cordelia, his younger daughter, away. And this puts in place a chain of events where things spiral down. And King Lear gets older and things go wrong. And there's this line which in King Lear, I think, which sums up so much what happens in life. And for children or young people when they're studying Shakespeare, why am I doing Shakespeare? This is perhaps one reason why, where King Lear, when he begins to realise what's going on, makes the point, I am a man more sinned against than sinning. I am a man more sinned against than sinning. And Lear is stating that the unjust treatment he received from his daughters, but acknowledges as well that he hadn't been a saint himself. Who is at fault here? Ultimately, I think they all have a degree of responsibility. And it would probably not be unfair to look at this family as being dysfunctional, maybe. And as we use the microscope to look in on one particular family dynamic here, we need to remember the telescope and consider and look at the lessons and the reminders for how our family dynamics operate. Yes, we may not be ancient tent dwellers in the heat of southern Israel, but we exist within family dynamics, and we need to look at how we ensure the good working of those dynamics. I suspect we may not need to scratch too hard to find examples of estrangement, which we might pass off as we don't see a lot of them. The ill-tempered crossword, which has tempered family dynamics for decades. the examples of favoritism, which lead to deep-rooted resentment and jealousy. It doesn't take much for a word to become an event to become an impediment, and an impediment to colour the entire family dynamic, possibly for generations. And I think I've shared with you before, my cousin, who's a few years older than me, who when he was in his mid-teens ran away from home. And he was away for many, many years. He would make occasional contact, and there was stuff going on in his family which was a cause behind that. He would make occasional contact, and I remember it was a big family thing when Matthew had made contact. If you'll forgive the fast forwarding in the story that we've read this morning, by just a few decades, we reach the story of Joseph. And thanks to Andrew Lloyd Webber, one of the better known Old Testament stories. And the reason I just fast forward it, possibly just out of sync with what I'm talking about, is there's something here about not learning the lessons of history. Way, way back many centuries ago, not long before after the Bible began, Jacob lived in the land of Canaan, a fine example of a family man. Jacob and sons depending on farming to earn their keep. Jacob and sons spent all their days in the field with sheep. This is Andrew Lloyd Webber, by the way, not the Bible. And then we get Reuben was the eldest of the sons of Israel. I don't think you know this. Pardon? It does. Reuben was the eldest of the children. Keep going. Yes, Naphtali and Issachar and Asher and Dan. Zebulun and Gad took the total to 9. Keith would have known this. Then we have Jacob and sons, Benjamin and Judah, which leaves only one. Jacob and sons, Jacob's favourite son. We have the lessons of history not being learnt. We have Rebecca, whose favourite son is Jacob, and then we have Jacob, who has a favourite son of Joseph. And we know the story of Joseph. We can even sing some of the songs from Joseph and the challenges of favoritism which go down the line. My mother is many, many things. Fastidious in ensuring that all her grandchildren are treated exactly the same way is one of them, as Jacob may, that's my Jacob, not the Jacob here, as Jacob may attest. Yesterday, I got back from football refereeing, and Lisa said to me, your mother's brought us up a 4th Easter egg. 4th Easter egg. The children each had their own Easter egg. They each had a Maltesers Easter egg. Have you eaten yours yet, Jacob? Sorry to wake you. They each had their own Maltesers Easter egg. But my mother had bought this other Easter egg for Lydia at the beginning. And the one that she bought for Lydia was one of those yellow mini egg Easter eggs. And then she realised that there was a significant difference between the mini egg Easter egg that she had got for Lydia, which was 97 grams, and the 127 gram Maltesers Easter egg that she had got for Jacob and for Isaac. Now, the difficulty, of course, we have, or more to the point that I have, how do you possibly split a 97 gram Easter egg 3 ways? What is a father to do? I don't know. It's a story for another day as to how my mother is going out of her way to ensure that she doesn't fall into the dangers of some of what she witnessed in her youth and perhaps what she experienced in her youth with regards to favoritism within families. But all of this talk of Easter eggs, all of this talk of rich tea biscuits is making me hungry. And indeed, listening to the earlier reading before from Liz was making me hungry as well. We've nibbled, no pun intended, at who was at fault. But we haven't strayed into the why yet. Perhaps if you're reading this again later this week, or maybe in one of those small groups that we've got. And if you're not a member of a small group, there are still vacancies and there's still spaces to come along to. Do get involved if you want to. Do grab me or Ruth at the end. If you're reading this passage later this week, look at all the senses that are involved in this narrative and how they all, mainly by their fallibility, play a part in the deception. Perhaps the most ironic is the sense of taste, which Isaac so prided himself on and let him down. Rebekah was able to pass off the gastronomic masterpiece that Esau was to make she was able to pass off the food that she'd made as food that Esau had made. Go and make that tasty food, Isaac says to Esau. Overheard by Rebekah, she makes the dish. And she's able to make it like Esau's. And this is ironic, because we know a chapter or two earlier, again in chapter 25, that Isaac's palate had long since governed his heart. Isaac, we know, who had a taste for wild game. Tasty food, eating, food I like, appears, and you don't need to be on University Challenge for this, in verse 4, in verse 7, in verse 9, in verse 10, in verse 14, in verse 17, in verse 19, verse 25, 31, and 33. It is by some distance, I would suggest, the recurring phrase or the recurring theme in this passage. It provides more than a hint about what is important to Isaac, and then therefore gives us more than a hint of what is the root cause of this chain of events. Your eyes are bigger than your belly is a line that you may have trotted out before. My mother will often comment on how I put on weight. In fact, this is perhaps most of the time that I see her. She comments that I put on weight. To be honest with you, it's a wonder that I can actually move at all with all this weight that I keep putting on. Yet if we get that microscope out and look at what we have here, we have individuals that are focusing on themselves, their needs, their wants, their desires, not looking towards God or what even is better for the family unit. But what do I want? I want that tasty food. The weaknesses of Isaac led to a chain of events which showcased the weakness and deception of the other family members. As we go on over the next few weeks into Joseph, we'll come across someone who married two sisters, but in reality loved only one. We come across someone who was passive while his wives squabbled. We come across someone who slept with the maid, who worshipped foreign gods. We come across someone who did nothing when his sons went and slaughtered an adjoining village. Someone who did nothing when his eldest son had an affair with a maidservant. His older son, his favourite son, Joseph, was sold into slavery. He spent 2 decades as a fugitive on the run. He was devious, he never preached. He never prophesied, he never said anything particularly profound. Yet, Jacob became the father of many sons. Son number 4 was called Judah. Son number 4 was called Judah, and Jesus came from the line of Judah. But we're a long way from that, some 2,000 years. And indeed, Jacob is a long way from God. Notice that when Isaac challenges Jacob by saying, "How did you manage to get this food so quickly?" Jacob responds by saying, I think it's in verse 11-ish, "The Lord your God gave me success." God is not Jacob's God at this time. Jacob ain't even going to church. He's probably not even showing any interest. As Ruth said to me at the beginning, he ain't a Christian. Ruth didn't use the word ain't, by the way. Ruth doesn't speak like that. God is not Jacob's God at this time. Jacob's a young person who's not interested in God, it seems. Going to chapter 28, the dream at Bethel. Jacob says, surely God, Lord, was in this place and I didn't know it. That's put another way, that church stuff might be okay for you, but I'll leave it if I can. It's not for me. Without wanting to spoil the next few weeks, Jacob's view and relationship with God alters. It's not overnight. It's certainly a slow burn, but he gets there. So as we sojourn over the next few weeks, we'll get our microscope out at someone who was distant from God, a trickster, someone on the run, a deceiver who, and a consequence of his deception, is that he never, at least it's not recorded that he did, he never saw his mum again. Someone who apparently doesn't learn the lessons of history. But I wonder, as we go through this passage from 2 Chronicles, a verse from 2 Chronicles, which was around the time that Solomon was rebuilding the temple, where God says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Perhaps as we get out this telescope, this verse will perhaps be something like that name that goes through that stick of rock to help permeate and help our understanding. Although distant, Jacob realigns and God comes close. And God chooses to use Jacob despite of Jacob, in the same way that God chooses to use us despite of us. May we pray. Father God, as we embark on a new series, as we embark on an exploration of this fella Jacob, give us eyes to glimpse into what was going on at the time, but the ability also to see how it links to the here and now, and to the us and the we. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Amen.